Can't nobody be free unless we're all free. It's no me and no you, it's just us. Street preacher, what a fan once called.
My point today is to really remind us what we're here to do and to push us to really take things to the next level. So the title of my message is, it's time to rise up and take things to a new level. I said it's time to rise up and take things to a new level. I want you to turn to somebody and I want you to say, it's time to rise up and take things to a new level. Now turn to somebody else, and this time act like you mean it. It's time to rise up and take things to a new level. All right, so we're all in agreement on that point. It's time for us to rise up. We need to recognize that there is a window of opportunity for us to rise up and address the challenges that exist within our society. But one of the first things that we have to do before we get there is to recognize that there is a narrative that is in place, that is a part of the dominant discourse. And for any of us who have attended public schools or lived in an inner city community or feel very passionate about these issues, that dominant discourse does not resonate with the truth of our reality. It does not resonate with the truth of what's happening to young people within our society. So one of the things that we need to begin to do is to reflect upon our own experiences of when we were in public schools or when we were in private schools, and thinking about what worked, what didn't, what could have been done differently to change your educational experience and to increase it. Because people can't argue with experience. I don't care what their narrative looks like. If you know that you went to a public school and something wasn't right, and you didn't have high quality teachers, and your books were written in and passed down from the suburbs, you didn't get to take field trips, then you recognize that there's a completely different reality than what the mainstream discourse is articulating. So again, reflect, because people can't argue with your experience. The next thing that we have to begin to do is to reframe the narrative. See, I spent a lot of my time as a civil rights attorney and a law professor looking at the dominant discourse, looking at the narratives and saying, oh, wait a minute, hold up. That does not square with my own experience. It doesn't square with what has happened historically. So I need to take this thing and reframe it and restructure it into language that makes sense, into language that is accessible to the average person walking down the street. Can I get an amen? Because so often we're looking at the literature and it is not written for us, it's not written for our community, and we feel that we have to meet those same standards. It's not that we can't articulate things that way, but why do we need to? When we're trying to convey things to the average, ordinary person and to help them understand what's going on. And just because something hasn't been articulated a certain way and you see it differently, that doesn't mean that there isn't validity to the way that you see it. Bring it to the table. It hasn't been said before, but maybe that's because the space is open for you to step into and begin to change the game and to reframe the information in a way that is succinct, palatable, and packs a punch. The next thing that you have to do is to rewrite that narrative. So recognize that many of you all, I call you kings and queens of the digital age, because you were born into it. You have an advantage that most people in society simply do not have. See, most of us weren't born at a time where there was email, where computers were readily accessible. We didn't have iPhones, we didn't have Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr. I mean, the list goes on and on of all the tools that you guys have access to in this generation. So use it to your advantage to rewrite the narrative. A lot of this is about looking at the status quo and then changing it. One of the things that I have noticed since joining the profession that I'm in and beginning to challenge systems is that there are a lot of people who are very comfortable with the status quo. But that's not going to be any of you, and that's not any of my students once they understand what's really at stake. one of the things that I try to push them to do is to do their work with a sense of urgency. I said, do your work with the sense of urgency. And a lot of times when we're in academic institutions, what some call ivory towers, we can be removed from the realities of the circumstances that the poorest of the poor face in our community. I know that when I moved to Minnesota in 2003, so I'm not from Minnesota, you can probably tell a little bit, I'm not from Minnesota. I was born in Jackson, Mississippi. I moved to South Central LA when I was 8.5, not the suburbs of LA, I moved to South Central LA. And I went to public school in LA Unified School District. I was in one of the poorest communities in the state, if not the country. There were mostly African Americans and Latinos in my community. And like Tupac said, trying to make $1 out of 15 cents, it's hard to be legit and still pay your rent. And that's what we saw amongst many of the people in our community. Many of the young men cycling in and out of the justice system had dropped out of school, and by 10, 11, 12 years old, had lost hope. And I see that as a travesty of justice because most of society just sat by and let it happen. And many people just assume, well, that's just the way that it is. So as a child growing up in that environment, I began to pay attention. I'm like, something is not right. And when I was 9 years old, I decided, you know what, I want to become a lawyer. Now, I didn't really know what a lawyer was. Okay, there were no lawyers in my family. No one in my family had ever graduated from college. But I had seen lawyers on television, and I said, okay, they're using their voice. They're using their position to change things. Well, I want to become a lawyer so that I can do that. And that was the dream that I held in my heart at 9 years old. Now, if you looked around my neighborhood or walked into the school that I attended, there was no way you would have thought that it was possible for me to become a lawyer. But I thank God for his grace because he surrounded me with people, primarily teachers, who treated me like I was their own daughter. They looked at me with love and gave me a sense of dignity and encouraged me to look beyond my circumstances. And not only did they encourage me verbally, but they opened doors to opportunity for me. So one administrator, for example, took me aside. She saw that I had a gift for public speaking, and she worked with me to hone that gift. Took me to present in front of the Council of Black Administrators within LA Unified School District. Took me to other places where I'm 12, 13 years old serving as the MC at an event where there were adults. One of my teachers paid for me to take ballroom dancing lessons. Now, I don't know, what my teacher had in mind in terms of even seeing me in those environments. But immediately going in, I realized I was one of the only poor kids in that environment. But I said, she paid for me to take these lessons, I'm going to take advantage. And then when I was 13, I was in the 8th grade. And one of my teachers came to me, and she said, we're going to recommend you for a program called A Better Chance. How many of you have heard of the A Better Chance program? Okay, so it's been featured on Oprah. I hadn't heard of A Better Chance, had not heard of, that's all right, we shaking things up, just let it fall. It is what it is. It is what it is. So my teachers recommended me for the A Better Chance program. They said, have your mom show up on this day, have you take a test. And I did it. I said, Mom, I need to show up here. I need to take a test. I didn't know what I was getting myself into. So I took a test. Several months later, I get a phone call from a school in Massachusetts saying that I had been awarded a full 4-year scholarship. So I left home at 14 and went off to boarding school in New England. And that changed my life because it helped to shift the paradigm. It helped me to see the difference between the haves and the have-nots. Because I tell you, I was one of the poorest people on that campus. When I went to the homes of my friends, many of their bedrooms were bigger than our apartment back home. And I realized that many of these folks had inherited generational wealth, while my family and people in my community had inherited generational poverty. So we need to understand the role that history plays. And many of the same people who have inherited generational wealth can look upon the poor and blame them for their circumstances and blame them for not pulling themselves up by their bootstraps, even though they don't have boots and they're struggling to survive. So it was in that environment that I began to do research. Anytime that I had a paper that was due, I would look at history, look at African American history, civil rights, again, to understand what is the framework that I can use to articulate the truth from my perspective and from the perspective of those who are suffering within my community. So getting into that situation, fast forward, went on to undergrad, went on to law school. Within a year after graduating from law school, I was hired to teach law. So you can imagine a girl from South Central LA, African American, going into not just teaching academia, but teaching law, where people of color are a very rare sight, unfortunately, and being in my 20s, in an environment where most of the other professors were 40 and above, and trying to learn how to navigate that system and connect to students. And I use my youth in that environment to my advantage, because what I saw was passion amongst the students to change things. Students who were not satisfied with the status quo. Students who knew that something was amiss and they were yearning for opportunities to begin to shift the paradigm into something that made sense in terms of their vision of reality. So when I got there in 2003, one of the things that I was told is that Minnesota is a great place to live. The distressed communities aren't so distressed. It'll be a wonderful place to raise your family. And that's what I believed for my first couple of years. But then I started reading the local African American newspapers. And they told a completely different story from what the mainstream publications were revealing about the community. Most of the things were rosy in the mainstream publications, how great the quality of life is, how wonderful this place is, how highly educated people are, how highly literate, how high their incomes are. But when I picked up the African American paper, I saw the exact opposite happening. I saw issues related to the opportunity gap, which I know most of us call the achievement gap, but I don't. Because I realize as somebody who's gone up through the hood, it's not about achievement, it's about access to opportunity. So I call it the opportunity gap. They were talking about the opportunity gap and how children were being pushed out of school and dropping out of high school and not attaining the level of expectation that people had placed on them to succeed. So I said, okay, that's just strange that I'm hearing this. Then I started hearing about high unemployment rates in the community. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, I thought we were one of the states that had the highest incomes in the nation. How is it that people of color are on the bottom in terms of their socioeconomic levels? Then I started looking at our criminal justice system. At the time, African Americans were 4% of the population, but they're 36% of the prison population. Hidden from the views of society when you read a paper that's focused only on public safety and not on the conditions that create that pipeline into the criminal justice system. So as I began to do the research and see what was going on, I said, no, something has to change. At the time, I was running a family law clinic at the law school. And just through prayer, I felt led to go into civil rights and start a civil rights clinic. And I kept feeling this nudge, and I knew that it was a risk because I was a new faculty member. I was untenured in that environment, and I know that there's a certain path if you want to continue to climb up the ladder within academia that you have to go through. But I kept feeling this nudge to start a civil rights clinic. And finally, I just yielded to that, and I just said, look, I'm going to start a civil rights clinic here or somewhere else, because I had to answer the calling to go in a completely different direction. So the first thing that I did once I made that declaration, I went out into the community and I sought out grassroots community activists who understood the plight of the people. And I said, tell me about the conditions that are facing the community here. And after a 2-hour conversation with the person who was then the president of the St. Paul chapter of the NAACP, I emerged from that conversation changed. My perspective was shifted, and I said, I'm going to start a civil rights clinic to begin to address these issues. And within a year or two, we shut down our family law practice and we started the Community Justice Project. And in the Community Justice Project, we realized that there is a sense of urgency. Why? Because we're up close and personal with the people who are impacted. We go into the jails and the prisons, into the public schools, into the alternative schools, into the poorest communities, and we interface with people who are suffering and struggling under the weight of oppression. Those who you will never see on MSNBC or CNN, but who have a story to tell. So that's how you can continue as an advocate to cultivate a sense of urgency. You go amongst the people who are suffering. You go amongst those who are struggling, and you begin to ask questions. You begin to hear their stories. And sometimes it means putting the academic knowledge that we've learned on a shelf so that we can go in as real human beings and not have our academic backgrounds be a barrier to connecting person to person, human to human, and story to story to get to the truth of the matter. So that's what we do in the Community Justice Project, to keep that sense of urgency alive. And that's what I would urge you all to do. Because institutions are constructs. They're made to keep people in and keep certain people out. So if you want to be a true advocate and take things to the next level, you have to go outside the walls of the construct, outside the walls of the institution, and get to the heart of the matter. And if that doesn't reignite a sense of urgency, then I don't know I don't know what will. The third thing that I think that we have to do, and I think this is probably the most important of all, that's to have courage. It's to have courage. I remember the first time that I testified before the Minnesota State Legislature, I was shaking. My hands were shaking because I didn't want to do it, first of all. I was nervous. I'm thinking, I was not trained for this in law school. And here I am having to face these people, mostly white middle-class people, and talk about the children in the juvenile justice system who were mostly poor children of color. And I'm thinking, how do I go before these people with the limited time that I'm given and able to actually communicate the pain that people are feeling and the suffering that they're feeling in a way that's going to resonate with the people? So I went through that process, and I had to overcome fear to get to that place. And now, after going through that and seeing that I had been prepared just from the work that I had been doing in the community, now someone calls me, come testify. Okay, what is it that you need? What is the narrative that we're putting in place to articulate the issue? So everybody, I don't care how accomplished they are, when you're about to go to the next level, you have to overcome fear and muster up some courage. And sometimes it's digging down deep into that place that you didn't even know existed to find the courage that you need to advocate. I told y'all we were just shaking things up. Each time, you see, we going to a new level, so we're continuing to shake things up. But courage is so important. And for those who lack courage, I would urge you to look at history. I mean, many of us are in school because we appreciate education, and we like to learn. So therefore, recognize that what you really need to know hasn't always been taught in your history books. I look back on my educational experience, slavery was maybe a page. The civil rights movement was maybe a paragraph. You go into California, places like Los Angeles, San Bernardino, and you recognize, wait a minute, why are the names so different unless Latinos were here first? That wasn't in my history book. That wasn't in my history book. So again, you have to dig deeper and figure out what is the truth. I recommend a book by Howard Zinn called A People's History of the United States. If you haven't read it, go read it, because again, he totally debunks the myths that exist within our society, and he begins to reframe the narrative in a way that explains a lot about why these challenges exist within our society. Because many of us have inherited things that have been unresolved throughout our history, like race relations. Do we really think that when Dr. King was assassinated, that racism just went away? No, it didn't go away. It went underground. It went underground. It's not dead. It's merely in disguise. And when I do research and look at the criminal justice system, and I recognize that 2.4 million people currently incarcerated, 40% of them African-American males, that's an example. of it being in disguise. Because there are two explanations for why that is the case. One is either that the system is deeply flawed, or two, we believe in the lie of black inferiority and that African Americans have some type of predisposition to wind up in the criminal justice system. So anytime we're looking at the system and we just brush off the fact that there are over 2 million people incarcerated, the majority of which are poor, many of whom have mental health issues, many of whom are people of color, then we need to begin to question what we see happening in our society and question our own belief system. Because again, you're not going to turn to mainstream media stations and seeing them have these kinds of conversations. It's just not simply going to happen because that narrative is not part of the dominant discourse. And if we start to articulate that narrative, it turns the entire system upside down. It turns it on its head. It disrupts the status quo. It causes some shaking to happen in society, which those who are in control don't want to see happen. So what happens? They keep us fighting against each other. They keep us ignoring poor white people and treating them like, what do we call poor white people? Be honest. Holler at me. What do we call them? Trash. Trash. And we don't even question that. We think that, oh, well, they're not like normal white people because they're poor. Well, why are they poor? Many of them have lived on the margins of society, been generationally poor, go to substandard educational institutions, and wind up where? In our criminal justice system. And that, again, is a narrative that's been running since the days of slavery, when they took poor white laborers and poor African Americans that they brought over from Africa who were working side by side and used race as a way of dividing these groups. We see the same narrative being played out again and again and again within our society. But to challenge these paradigms, it takes courage. It takes a willingness to get outside of our comfort zones and to make sure that our lives matter. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with going to school, getting an education, and trying to achieve your version of the American dream. If that's how you feel, do what you got to do. But for those who actually want to have meaning within our society, it's going to take doing something different. I'm not saying you don't need to support your family. Everybody does. But you have to seek out ways to support your family while also, and probably more importantly, thinking about what is in the interest of the greater good. Because as Dr. Martin Luther King said, all life is interrelated. We're caught in we're caught in a network of mutuality tied together into a single garment of destiny. So whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. We're made to live together because of the interrelated structure of reality. So if something is happening to the poor in Denver, then it's affecting those of us in Minnesota. Something is happening in Mississippi, it's affecting people in California. We need to recognize that if we continue to stay silent, that through the passage of time, things aren't going to get better, they're only going to get worse. And as young people, people don't like to show the power that you all have in our society to change things. But if you look back at the 1960s, although Dr. King receives a lot of the credit for what happened during the civil rights movement, in reality, young people were the engine that drove that movement. Young people left their colleges and institutions and went down to places like Mississippi and knocked on the doors of poor black people and said, I want to register you to vote. I'm going to stand with you so that you can challenge the status quo within our society, so that you can challenge the laws and policies and systems that are designed to oppress you. Because what's the point of me being a student, getting my degree and achieving the American dream if there's others who have no access to it? See, that's what the students of the 1960s thought about when they defied what society expected them to do, what their parents may have expected them to do, and they went out and they fought for justice. And we see that through their work, they risked their lives. In fact, 3 students were killed by the Klan, 2 of whom were Jewish and 1 was African American, found dead in the woods in Mississippi because they went out and stood for freedom and justice and equality on behalf of the poor. Some students went to jail because they were saying, I'm going to stand for what I believe is the foundation of this country, at least according to what we've learned in our history books, even though we know in reality it hasn't played out that way. There are still some principles of freedom and justice and equality for all, and the life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness for all. Those principles are what they had in mind when they risked life, limb, and livelihood to go out and fight for freedom. So you all have a legacy, but you got to go dig it up. People, they don't want you to understand the power that you have to change things in our society. And like Frederick Douglass said, power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has, and it never will. We have to recognize that without struggle, there is no progress. Because sometimes we just want a tension-free life. We want this, nice little version of peace. But then when I go in the hood and see kids dead on the streets, or without access to a place to live or food to eat, then to me, that's the most kind of violence that can happen within our society. And we're taught to have eyes closed and ears shut to the plight of those who are suffering. But again, to challenge these systems, it takes courage. It takes courage. There's a young woman that I want to bring to your attention if you haven't heard of her. How many of you have heard of the organization called Kiva? Kiva? So some of you have. So there's a young woman named Jessica Jackley who had graduated from college, and she was on the path to, climbing the ladder in corporate America. And she just had a crisis at one point and said, I feel like something is missing, something needs to change. And she just quit her job. Now, I'm not telling you all to go quit your job. I don't want you to say, I was at an SFIR conference and the lady told me go quit my job. No, that is not what I'm saying, okay? I'm just showing you what she did as an example. You have to use wisdom when you're making those decisions. Because you see, I still have my job, and I'm up here talking to you all. But I use it to advance the cause of justice within our society. So Jessica Jackley, she quit her job, and she went to Africa, and she started talking to the people, poor farmers, poor people who were struggling to make ends meet. And what she decided at that moment was, I need to find a way to cultivate their entrepreneurial spirit. Not, I need to help these poor people. I need not charity, because this is more, as Dr. King said, than just flinging a coin to a beggar, but it's looking at the structures that create the conditions and beginning to address those. So Jessica Jackley went there. She saw that there were people in need, and she was tired of what she called, I guess it was called poverty porn or something, where you're constantly, those little commercials, a nickel a day will help this child, eat. And it's like this poor black kid with a swollen belly in Africa. So she was just tired of seeing that because she felt like it was exploitation of the poor. And it did nothing to actually change the underlying structures. So as she met with the farmers and entrepreneurs, she got excited. She went back home. She started emailing family and friends, saying, look, this person needs a sewing machine so that they can take their business to the next level. This person needs money so that they can get a bigger space. This person needs to buy some other type of equipment. And what happened was that she started asking people if they would lend these entrepreneurs money. And from there, just that little exchange that began to happen, one young person desiring to make a difference, now hundreds of millions of dollars per year are loaned out to people in countries where they don't have access to capital and resources. And they have over a 90% repayment of the loans. That's, again, this young woman, I believe she was in her 20s at the time, early 20s, when she and a person set Kiva up. Look up Kiva. I think it's either K-E-V-A or K-I-V-A. You can look it up online so that you can understand the story of one person who was determined. See, we're still shaking stuff up. That's all I'm saying. To make a difference. To make a difference. So I want you all, as you're continuing on to the rest of this conference, is to begin to think about, what can I do to make a difference? Does the current narrative that exists out there, does it actually make sense for what I experienced? Or is there a new paradigm that I need to introduce? And then it's thinking about who else is with me. Because even if you have radical ideas or different ways of thinking, there's usually somebody who agrees with you based on their own experience or based on their desire to buck the status quo and to go against the grain. So you want to find people who will stand with you to fight against injustice. And believe me, there are people who are hungry back at your institutions, back in your communities, who want to change things. Because it's not just about us. We need to think about our children, our children's children, and their children, and the very viability of this country in the fight for equal education, access to jobs, access to resources, so that everybody has the opportunity to dive in and live those principles of justice, freedom, and equality for all. Thank you. You guys are embarrassing me. Thank you. I'll take a few questions. Thank you, Chris. I'll take some questions. Go ahead. Here, you want to pass them? All right, go ahead. Okay, so that's a great question, and you probably don't even know this, but one of the things that happened in the Twin Cities is that the students, my colleague, the community, and I helped to create a nonprofit organization called Brotherhood, Inc. You can look it up online. Our website needs developing. But Brotherhood, Inc. is it's a 501c3 organization. And basically it's for young African-American men, ages 16 through 24, who've been involved in the criminal justice system or gangs or who are at risk. One of the things that happened back when I said I was going in a different direction to start Civil Rights Clinic was that as I started looking at the statistics and doing the research, I realized that young African-American males were falling through the cracks at a rapid pace. For those who don't know, the high school graduation rate in Minnesota for African Americans is 49%. The graduation rate for Latinos, 49%. The graduation rate for American Indians, 42%. English language learners, 52%. So very low graduation rates for our marginalized populations. And when we saw what was happening with young African American males who were dropping out of high school, who were unemployed and underemployed, and who were heading into the criminal justice system. So at the time you go into juvenile justice in our two largest counties, 90% of the kids would be African American boys and other boys of color. So we decided, okay, we need to do something about this. Even though we're in a law school, and law schools typically are not designed to address social issues, we said we got to do something. So one of the things that we did was I had students start looking around the country and seeing what programs are out there that have been effective in addressing marginalized segments of the population. We stumbled upon Homeboy Industries. I know folks from LA are probably familiar with Homeboy. So I went to Homeboy, fell in love with the place because it felt like home. It didn't feel like an institution. It didn't feel like a nonprofit. It felt like a home away from home. So the law school paid for two of my students to travel to Homeboy Industries. They interviewed nearly the entire staff, and we said, okay, we need to bring this model back to the Twin Cities with a specific focus on young African Americans. Homeboy was founded by a Jesuit priest over 20 years ago. He moved into one of the poorest parishes in LA. There's a Latino community where young people had been involved in gangs, dropping out of school, and unemployed. And after connecting with the young people, starting a school, they said, well, we need jobs. So he knocked on the doors of corporations and asked for help. They refused to help him. Eventually, he received help from his parish and from a movie director, of all things, and actually started a bakery, which was their first social enterprise called Homeboy Bakery. Now it is a multi-million-dollar operation. They're the largest employer of former gang members in the country. If you're able to get to LA, go check it out. It's just really powerful to see people who society was ready to toss out and throw into the trash, now helping to run the organization and also being managers within the organization, going to work every day and giving back to their communities. So that to me is a powerful testament. Now, what I found in Minnesota in trying to pitch this issue was that there was not a lot of reception to being able to do this. Again, what I bucked up against was the status quo. People saying there are tons of nonprofits, and basically if the people aren't taking advantage of them, then it's the fault of the people. And I knew that many of the nonprofits were not designed with that segment of the population in mind. So one of the things when you're setting out to start an organization and to reach young people, it's really figuring out what it is that they need from their perspective. Going out and talking to them, hearing from them, hearing their stories, and then thinking about what is the paradigm, what is the structure that I need to create that can help facilitate this young person's success. And sometimes it does mean being culturally specific or gender specific so that the program has a greater chance of working. So although we went out, I don't know how many doors we knocked on, how many people we asked for help, including mayors and things like that. It took until December of 2011 for us to actually open the doors. And that was because we realized if we don't do it, no one else will. So we had to go raise the money. We started hosting fundraising dinners and other types of activities at St. Thomas. And we just really got out there and just started hustling legally to, to raise the seed money that we would need to have enough to open the doors for the organization. So right now we have 8 to 10 young men, all of whom have been in the criminal justice system. But it's been fantastic because they have all since graduated from high school, since they have been a part of the program. It's like the hope in these young people has been renewed, and now they see, okay, this is why in education matters. Because if you're living in an impoverished community and you look around and you haven't seen education work for anybody, and then you go to school and you're treated like an outsider or like you're some trash that just blew in on the street, why would you want to keep going to school every day? So one of the things that we have to begin to do when we're thinking about programs for youth is not just saying, let's close the high school graduation rate, or let's, fix the achievement gap. Great. But what I'm looking to do is help to capture a young person's imagination. Because once you do that, not only are they're going to do those things, which are the foundational benchmarks, they're going to exceed those things and really begin to discover their purpose, their talents, and their gifts within society. The other thing that we had to do that was so important, because we're an institution, we had to go out and get community buy-in. We couldn't just do it on our own. We had to go find stakeholders within the community, grandmas, grandfathers, uncles, young people who wanted to see change, and we just started gathering and meeting once a month saying, what can we do next? And each time, someone would do something to move the ball along. So you got to go out and look for a community stakeholder so that you're not doing the work in isolation. But it's going to take hard work and determination to start a program. And you don't have to do a 501c3 either. You can find a local high school. Do you have children who are falling through the cracks here and who need support? Well, I'd like to start coming and meeting them and volunteering. And it's like Dr. King said, you take the first step in faith without seeing the whole staircase. Once you begin to do that and you meet the young people and learn about their needs, new ideas will spark. Others might want to join along, and before you know it, you have an awesome program that's meeting the needs of young people. So show up, be authentic, keep coming back to the table. Know that not everybody's going to have open arms, but the more you come, the more that you'll feel part of the community, and people will feel like you are part of the community. And those are keys that'll open the doors to the next level. Absolutely, because people begin to recognize you. They'll begin calling you and emailing you, asking you to show up to places. When it comes to young people, a lot of what we do, because these young people have been hurt, they've been in the system, they've been rejected within schools. They've been suspended, like I don't know how many times over minor things. We have to really, again, we have to get to their level and just connect with them without judgment. So a lot of it is figuring out what is it that they like to do, who do they want to be, have they figured that out, and just little by little beginning to show them that you actually care about them. That's what made the difference when I walked in Homeboy Industries. I felt love in the atmosphere, not an institution. So if you can create an environment where people feel like you love them, they are going to flock to you, and it'll make it a lot easier for you to accomplish those goals that you're setting out to achieve. Go ahead. Absolutely. I think one of the things that we have to do is be intentional about identifying those who have promise, but even identifying those who other people don't feel are worth anything. That's actually who I go after, in my work. So I'm thankful for the teachers recognizing my potential, but because of what they did for me, I'm like, I have a debt to pay. So that's one of the things. So I'm able to influence a lot of people and young people in the community because of them investing in me. So I think, one, a lot of schools don't really have a framework on being intentional about reaching those, not only at the top, who with a little bit of a nudging and support can go on to the next level, but those who we know without intervention will wind up in the penitentiary. So we have to think about these young people from an assets-based perspective and not a deficit-based perspective. Which so often when you start looking at the policies and you look at the way the policies are implemented, you realize, okay, we're seeing these young people as criminals, as offenders. We have police now in many of the schools who are responsible for handling minor disciplinary infractions. So for example, when I was in school, a fight, maybe you would be suspended. Back in my day, you might be paddled by a teacher in the back room. But nowadays, you might be let off of school in handcuffs. And no one questions those practices. Now, I know in LA Unified, we're starting to see a lot of motion there in terms of young people working with adults to challenge those practices within the system. But the majority of systems, they don't even pay attention. It's just par for the course, business as usual. And what we don't recognize is that the kids we're pushing out and that we're locking up at a young age, many of them don't know how to read. Many of them are kids with special needs, either a mental disability, sometimes with a physical disability, and kids who have experienced trauma. Counted out associated with coffee is powerful because they're breaking down stereotypes. They know about coffee, they're engaging customers, and they are learning that they have value within our society. So now that people can actually see it, many of them are supportive of it. Because the other thing, they know that if we are keeping young people employed and engaged, that helps to increase public safety, not decrease it. Does that answer your question? So you just got to choose your battles. Go ahead. Well, I think one of the things that's needed is humility. And that is very hard for people who have lived a privileged life to realize that they don't know it all. Because all of the constructs in society tells you you know it all. I mean, you become masters of knowing the mainstream middle class way because that's what you're born into and that's how you're raised. So to have voices that are showing something different, a lot of times there's a resistance initially and it challenges people's perspective because they haven't heard it before, or at the very least they haven't been willing to listen to it before. So I think humility is important, being willing to go into a space recognizing that even if people try to defer to you as the authority, beginning to see them as the authority because they're the ones who are living those experiences, and then creating ways for their voices to be heard. So like with the program with Brotherhood, we are teaching the young men how to be public speakers. We're sending them into spaces as young black men to tell their stories, to tell their perspectives on what's happening, and people are surprised by that because they're used to a talking head getting up there and articulating something with, a lot of rhetoric and intellectualism. So I think that it's going to be important for any allies, one, being humble, two, being willing to listen, and three, not allowing yourself to be the authority in spaces where there are people of color who are actually experiencing these issues. It doesn't mean that you can't help and that you don't have something valuable to say, but what I'm hearing from people is that they also want to see white people go back into their own communities and begin to challenge the paradigms within those communities that are actually creating the oppression that people of color are frustrated about. We don't see enough of that happening. We don't see enough of that happening. So that's one thing, as you're gaining knowledge and understanding, going and educating those in your community who other people maybe are not going to be able to reach and saying, look, here's the real story. Will you come with me here? We just need to sit and listen and then figure out how to use our power and privilege to change the status quo. I'm being recorded, so I'm not going to say what I know. I'm just joking. I'm just kidding. You got to have humor. But no, really, what I would say, part of the problem and what you just articulated is the fact that the professor is putting the burden on you to be the person who is sharing those experiences. The professor should also be able to bring in those frameworks and experiences into the classroom as the authority figure and to actually lay the foundation. This is how we're going to learn about what you need to know to go into these schools and to be effective. So from my perspective, I would actually go talk to the professor and say, look, here's how I'm feeling. I'm feeling like I'm the only one, because it's hard being a marginalized voice in a situation like that where other people don't understand or don't share your perspective. So I would talk to my professor. If you have books on your list that get to the point, I would share those and say, can you be intentional about beginning to include this in your lectures? And also encourage people to have the types of experiences where maybe they're going to the criminal justice system or the juvenile justice system and meeting with the people who are in there so they can tell you how the education system failed them. So that's what I would do as a starting point. And then decide how much, I always think about it in terms of when to speak and when to listen. So there are times when they're saying something that maybe you disagree with. It's being strategic about saying, I understand what you're saying from your experience. However, here is what I've seen, and just, breaking it down from that place. So you can find points of agreement, but also knowing where you can agree to disagree. But go back to your professor, because they shouldn't just be putting that burden on you. It reminds me of when you're the only African-American student in the class, and they're talking about civil rights or black history or criminal justice, or the only Latino, and they're talking about immigration. They're like, what do you think? It's like, really? That's just not acceptable. So you are feeling the same thing that many of us feel when we're the only one in the room. And you got to find those ways to address it with the authority figure who should be doing something different. Yes, we are. Right. Right. Well, I would say there are probably people here from LA. So raise your hand if you're from LA. Okay. So have you connected with this community of folks? So where are you all when he needs help going into the school? Because so you right. 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 That's amazing. Right. Right. Well, there's a few things that you can do. One, I want to commend you. I think we should give him a round of applause because it's tough. It really is tough, going back and actually feeling like you're shouldering the burden for the futures of all the young people that you're influencing. So I want to commend you for doing that and seeing the need and actually going out and meeting it. The other thing that I would say is I would connect with the cohort from LA before you leave, exchange numbers, because even if people are commuting, if you say once a month, can you come, or even every other month, and just begin to schedule people who can come and spend a couple of hours, then that's going to multiply your efforts. And the fact that they're here means that they care about the issue. So you already have a community. Because of all the folks who are here who are already part of a community, that means that they have networks back home that you can begin to tap into. So I would say you can set up a Facebook page and do a call for volunteers and people to support you. You can do video blogs and ask teachers, look, if I do this blog of a day in my life where I'm at school, will you have the students watch this video blog for credit? You can tweet, you can use social media as well so that when you can't be there, they're still getting the message that you're trying to convey. But you have a community here. I would start right here with this network, see what people are able to commit, and then think about how to use social media to spread the word and recruit additional volunteers. Okay? Okay, two more, so I'll go with you. It is critically important. I mean, with the success that we've been able to have in the Community Justice Project, it would not be happening if we did not have the support of the community. If they thought that we were just representing the institution and we were just flying in with the cape trying to save people, that would not be effective in terms of actually building trust between the community and your group or institution. So I think one of the things that is important and has been for our work is that we actually create opportunities to engage the community. So one of the things that we do is we go and look for organizations that have a grassroots approach to their work. I mean, that's really the community that I probably identify most with in Minnesota, grassroots community organizers, and they're usually young people around your age who are full of energy and excitement and who are determined to change things. So I would find the grassroots organizations, young people, and older civil rights organizations that are, about looking towards the future, and really say, okay, we want to create this forum where we bring in the community, or who should I be talking to in the community who can, give some context to this issue and who can join me in this fight. So just a couple of examples. One of the things that we did a few years back is we actually helped to tear down one of the, actually the biggest gang database in our state. And that happened because the NAACP approached us and said, young men of color, African American, Latino among, are being stereotyped by law enforcement and placed in a gang database. Will you help? So the first thing that we did was we hosted a forum, and we invited the stakeholders that actually administered the database, so law enforcement, people in government, to be on that panel. And then we had community members from the audience. We were a new organization, so we couldn't just send out a flyer saying, hey, Community Justice Project is doing this, when nobody knew who we were. And we didn't have enough community credibility at that time. So we partnered with other organizations to draw the people in. And then after that, each step of the way, when we had a hearing at the legislature, we would send out an e-blast through our community partners to get the word out to say, show up at the legislature Friday morning at 9. Here's the issue. And people would actually show up. Or we said, under the Data Practices Act, send this letter in to the sheriff asking if you're in the database. Because we said at the very least, even if you're not in there, they're going to be spending staff time under law responding to your requests so that they realize that there are people who care in the community. So you cannot do this work without community involvement. It's arrogant to do otherwise. One more. Oh, go ahead. Right. That's a great question. Actually, part of my research focuses on the impact of women in the criminal justice system and the negative effects on their children and the community at large. So I agree that a lot of the attention is focused on men. Part of that has to do with the fact that 92% of the prison population are men. 8% are women. And when you begin to look at the issue, you're absolutely right that there are numerous effects that happen when a woman is incarcerated. The majority of incarcerated women are mothers. So that means that when they go to prison, their children wind up either living with relatives, many of whom are usually poor, or in foster care. And that sets in motion a cycle where kids are experiencing trauma. Sometimes they're experiencing abuse in those other situations, and they are more likely to wind up in the justice system. So my recommendation when looking at, for example, the war on drugs, which is how the number of women in prison started to multiply beginning in the mid-1980s. So essentially, when the war on drugs started, one of the things that happened was that conspiracy laws were put in place. So let's say that a boyfriend or a husband was dealing drugs. If the woman knew about it, let's say she didn't deal drugs, but she knew about it. She let drugs, be in her home, or she answered the phone. Well, that was enough for that woman to be charged as part of a conspiracy. And that meant that women, by being charged as part of a conspiracy, whatever amount of drugs that crew was selling, that was also attributed to that woman. So you have women serving 10, 20, 25 years in prison for peripheral involvement in drug-related activity. So one of the things that's important is educating people about these issues, making sure that the policies actually make sense at the end of the day, that we are actually deterring crime and not creating a whole new wave of people who are going to wind up in the criminal justice system, particularly children. And schools need to begin to be responsive to the fact that children are coming to school and they are grieving because they have a dad or a mom who is incarcerated. Many schools are not equipped to even think about that issue, even though children of color are disproportionately represented amongst that group. And it is connected to some of the behavioral issues that people complain about when they're looking at the schools. So I would like to see young women who are passionate about these issues beginning to elevate these concerns, because the plight of women is hidden from this conversation, but your voice can make a difference. Your voice can make a difference. So with that, I have to conclude because I know your stomachs are probably grumbling for lunch, but I will be around for a few hours before I catch my flight. But it's been a blessing to connect with you all. Keep up your work. God bless.
To me, all of y'all look exactly the same. Fear, faith, compassion, and pain. I started rhyming just to be somebody. I found out that I already was. 'Cause can't nobody be free unless we're all free. There's no me and no you, it's just us. Street preacher, what a fan once called me. I've been called worse and tried to live up. Hope you don't mind a few more stories. I swear to God, y'all, I tell them with love.